Thank you, Eunice, for giving me all the legal questions. I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV. For those of you not familiar with Citizens for Global Solutions, we're a national membership organization that strategically promotes U.S. engagement with international organizations to solve global problems. We believe international cooperation is essential to resolve global problems, to build a safer and more secure world. More information at globalsolutions.org about programs, memberships, internships, etc. No, Libya didn't kill R2P. In fact, I believe the concept is here to stay. Probably what's more on the way out is the policy of non-state intervention dealing with mass atrocities. I was fortunate to be in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates when Security Council Resolution 1973 was being debated. So I was giving a presentation on UN reform. And so I was able to talk with quite a number of Gulf state policymakers and academics. And there was this incredible support and call for establishing a no-fly zone, for really strengthening what had started on Security Council Resolution 1970 at that point. And while they really wanted to see that, there was also a pretty good concurrence that they did not want to see NATO troops on the ground. They understood that it's kind of difficult to protect babies from 30,000 feet. They really didn't have a good answer on exactly how to do that, but they knew at that point military, and particularly European military and U.S. military on the ground in Libya would not be a good thing. So they were very much about, let's take this one step at a time. It seemed to be the overall assessment. We want to move forward, but let's take it one step at a time. And I think that's a pretty good characterization about how we're engaging and getting involved in the responsibility to protect. Today I really just want to touch base on really how much since 2005 on the outcome document to the UN Summit when responsibility to protect was adopted by the General Assembly by consensus, to deal with these four crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, how much it really has been a game changer in terms of how the international community is reacting to mass atrocities. A little bit more about the U.S. position regarding responsibility to protect. I want to touch base on how we really need to broaden our recognition and acknowledgement of R2P actions that happen, but we just don't call responsibility to protect. And then also, finally, a little bit more on the role of the Security Council for permanent members regarding responsibility to protect. So, first off, let's just take a look about how much of a game changer this has been. What happened in Libya really was lightning fast when you compare it to some of the atrocities that have happened in the past. Think about it. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that war began in 1996 with all the killings, the ethnic violence, the mass rapes. It really wasn't until 2003 from 1996, it took 3 years for the UN to establish MONUC, the peacekeeping force there, and then it wasn't until 2003 that the French got involved to really try to significantly stamp down on some of the violence there. In Darfur, the crisis began in 2003, and the UN didn't create UNIMIT until 2007. So there you had this really long, stretched-out period of violence before there was this significant reaction by the international community. The Libyan protest and the accompanying violence began on February 17th, and 9 days later, the UN Security Council voted on Resolution 1970 to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, establish an arms embargo, and apply the sanctions. And then less than 1 month after that, when it was clear that Gaddafi was not going to actually comply when he said, we're going to stamp you out like rats and cockroaches, Resolution 1973 was invoked at that point. So there really has been this acceleration and this focusing of the international community about how it responds to and its responsibility to be able to prevent and then react to mass atrocities when they happen. And we talk about this here. We all have a basic understanding of responsibility to protect. I think it's also important to understand how little is known about it throughout our country. I speak in many, many parts of the country, typically to audiences that are interested in international affairs and global policy. And if I say, how many of you know who Responsibility to Protect is? Typically, I may get 3, 4 hands up in an audience this size that already know about it. So there's this huge education curve that needs still to happen before we could really effectively implement it. Fortunately, we've had some mentions lately on CNN, on Rachel Maddow, but still it's very early on in the process. What is encouraging is the role that the U.S. government is playing on it. Not too long ago in March at the Holocaust Museum, at an event honoring the late Representative Tom Lantos, Vice President Biden said, quote, "We've made the responsibility to protect the simple but novel concept that states must shield their populations from atrocity a core element of our national security strategy." He then went on to say, when a state engages in atrocity, it forfeits its sovereignty. And there's been this linkage between atrocities, responsibility, and sovereignty that has been made and really is getting traction. As you know, mentioned, it is reflected in our national security strategy, in the Presidential Security Directive, and so I think we'll see more and more of this. We also need to understand that there are a lot of actions that are happening regarding the responsibility to protect that we just don't use those words. I mean, if you think about it, you know, there's Pillar 1, which is a country doing what it needs to do to stop atrocities, and that happens on a regular basis, and it's never ever talked about in terms of responsibility to protect. Pillar 2, where the states in the region need to take some action and help that country. There, you know, if you think about it, Kenya, where there was a lot of effort from the U.S., from other states within Africa to really stop the violence there, that really was a Pillar 2, in my opinion, responsibility to protect, maybe even verging on to Pillar 3. Southern Sudan, where there was a possibility of a genocide breaking out instead of elections happening. And there, once again, NGOs, many nations within Africa, the U.S., European countries really all came in to try to work very, very hard, and we had elections instead of a mass atrocity. And I think what just happened with the Arab League as well is also another Pillar 2 scenario where regional nations are engaging before it gets to that Pillar 3 level. It might lead to that, but the problem is we're not, as a community of activists, of academics, of policymakers, really saying, aha, responsibility to protect is happening. So what happens is, the only time we start calling it responsibility to protect is when it gets to the point where we've already failed in terms of prevention, where the Security Council is actually engaging in this and starting to talk about interventions and and sanctions and other stronger pieces. So I think if we want responsibility to protect to be successful, we need to broaden the dialogue about when it's actually being employed, so there's a better understanding of what it is. Because if it comes back down to just another word for Western humanitarian intervention, we're going to have problems keeping it successful. So I think that's part of our job as a community of civil society and others to really keep making that point. In terms of the other point I wanted to talk about just briefly is also the role of the Security Council. As was mentioned, there was this double veto by Russia and China in terms of the Syrian pretty watered down resolution. And one of the things that we're starting to talk about is going on beyond responsibility to protect, but a specific role of the Security Council permanent 5 members of a responsibility not to veto. Think about it. If you have a responsibility to protect, and you've already signed on to this as a member of the United Nations, you voted for it in the General Assembly, then if you're a permanent member of the Security Council, when it comes to situations of dealing with mass atrocities, you have a responsibility not to use your veto to protect your client states, your people that you want to be able to do business with when they are performing mass atrocities. We do not want to give P5 members a free ride to use their veto in this way. So one of the things that we've been talking about is a responsibility not to veto. In Syria we have a death toll over 3,500 right now, which is increasing every day. And we believe that Security Council members have a choice. They either need to agree to stop using their veto in situations dealing with mass atrocities, when otherwise a majority of the Security Council would go ahead with a resolution, or they can maintain their status as controlling members of a body that becomes increasingly irrelevant. And so as we move forward, we want to be able to talk about this. It's really up to us as people interested in international law, as civil society, to be able to move forward with this and push it forward.
I have a question about what's the tipping point. So, for instance, especially with regard to sovereignty, what is the tipping point when there could be a legitimate and lawful R2P intervention between, like, for instance, a domestic affair, which I believe the UN Charter says you're not, as an international community, allowed to get involved with internal affairs, versus it becoming an international matter? And I'm wondering, is that use Kogan's? How is it justified under customary international law?
I'll give you start with a non-legal answer. At its core, responsibility to protect basically says that nations are sovereign. But with sovereignty comes responsibility. And it's limited very, very clearly to just 4 specific crimes. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing is the language that has been used surrounding it. So the tipping point becomes when nations allow their populations, and notice it speaks about populations, not citizens, their populations to be subjected to these crimes, either because they don't have the capacity to be able to halt them, or they are the actual perpetrators of them. So bottom line for me, the tipping point is when governments are using helicopter gunships, artillery, and tanks against protesters who simply want their voice heard. As we saw in Libya, as we see in Syria, to me, that's the tipping point. And I think it's pretty clear. We're not talking about just some riots or some domestic violence that's happening. We're talking about we're talking about systematic use of force is clearly part of this as well. When does it finish? It doesn't. Once again, responsibility to protect is not just an active intervention. That's when everything else has failed. That's when everything else, the wheels have fallen off and everything else has gone wrong, and a lot of people have not done their job. So even in the case of Libya, in a post-Gaddafi Libya, the responsibility to protect still rests upon the new transitional government and the governments in the region and the international community to be able to do their pieces within the 3 pillars of responsibility to protect. You will see, for example, one of the pieces invoked by the Security Council was a referral to the International Criminal Court. And you will see the prosecutor of the court looking not only at members of Gaddafi's regime, but also as members of the transitional government and forces, if they're acting out and taking actions that still put those 4 crimes out on the table. So I don't think that there's no line drawn in the sand, because once again, it's a continuum that we're dealing with. So and typically, one of the reasons why it's important to be able to have a good means of ending conflict is because if you don't end it properly, that's just the beginning of the next conflict. So there's this conflict cycle. So within the context of that cycle, there is always this responsibility to protect populations from these different crimes. Regarding, the relationship of the intervention in Syria to how the reaction in Libya, Libya to Syria, I think in some case there was a bit of buyer's remorse after Libya, and NATO, they went in, did the kind of intervention that they did on the part of some nations. And I think it's important to understand in Libya, you had the Arab League asking for action, the Gulf Coast states asking for action. You had the Libyan ambassador at this point who was asking for action. So there was a lot of pieces that lined up to make this happen. In Syria, you don't have that scenario at all, and it's just been more slowly developing now that the Arab League has taken its position. I think you'll see that this building towards more robust action at the Security Council if the intervention of the Arab League or individual states don't make a difference. And then, can it be a big power tool? Well, I suppose, any political tool within the international community can be something that big powers will utilize. But it's also something that I think one of the reasons you're seeing China and you're seeing Russia kind of back off a little bit more is they're concerned that the more this concept of the responsibility to protect, that you can't go around and shoot your demonstrators when they're saying things that you don't like. They're probably scratching their heads and saying, now wait a second, we have to do that sometimes. Do we want to really allow this norm to grow? So on one hand, yes, it can be a big power tool, but it also, I think, is something that could be limiting the actions of big powers and something that they're concerned about, which is why we want to push even harder to make it a norm that's accepted and adopted.